Hello, ladies and gentlemen. This is Kimberly Tyson. I'm the Program Director with the Embryo Adoption Awareness Center and Nightlight Christian Adoptions. Welcome to today's webinar, Partnering in Embryo Adoption Services. The purpose of our webinar today is to communicate to the fertility clinic community the many benefits both for their patients and for their business in partnering with an embryo adoption provider. Our presenters today, next slide please, will be Kimberly Tyson and Kelly Poffenberger. Our friend Deborah Schrag isn't able to join us today because of a medical emergency, so we wish her well. But Kelly and I are well equipped to handle the contents of this webinar. We've begun a targeted outreach here at the Embryo Adoption Awareness Center to clinics throughout the nation to encourage forging closer bonds between the clinics and an embryo adoption program. We look forward to having direct discussions with each of our interested clinic attendees today after the webinar, and we'll be sending out some information after the webinar for you to peruse. Next slide, please. During the presentation, all participants will be in a listen-only mode. There will be a question and answer session at the end of the presentation using the questions that you submit through the Q&A feature. You may submit your questions at any time during the session, and we will answer as many of your questions as possible at the end of the presentation period. But I would encourage you, if you think of a question, to submit that question at the time that you think about it, and those things will just queue up and we'll have an opportunity to answer them. To ask a question, you simply click on that Q&A panel in the lower right-hand portion of your screen. You see that enclosed in a big red rectangle on the screen there, and then you click the send button, which is in the red circle. And if you happen to be in the full screen mode, you'll see that little icon right above there. And if you open that up, it will open up this panel on the screen in the lower right-hand corner. And it only does that on your screen. You don't have to worry about messing up anybody else out there on our webinar today. When you submit a question, it will be visible to all of us as panelists, but not visible to other attendees. We expect this presentation to last 30 to 45 minutes with time for Q&A, so we should be done by the top of the hour. And we'll be distributing a white paper summary of today's presentation and a comprehensive list of all the questions with answers that were submitted today during the webinar. If you are experiencing any technical difficulties, please call WebEx directly at the number on the screen. You might want to jot this down quickly just in case. I don't expect any difficulties, but it's always good to have it on hand. It's 866-229-3239, and as a reminder, our presentation is being recorded today. All right, so let's dive into the content of our presentation today. And I'm going to start out with infertility and family building in the 21st century. So historically, adoption was the only family building option open to people who were experiencing infertility. And adopting an infant in the United States was a little bit more accessible than it is today. Today, less than 2% of the women who are experiencing an unplanned pregnancy will place that child for adoption. Many of these women are now being encouraged to parent these children, or they're aborting. And so there are fewer babies that are available through the domestic system. And internationally, people do still adopt internationally, but international governments are making it more and more difficult for children to be placed into the United States from that country, as some of you may be aware of in the papers recently about Russia closing adoption to American citizens for reasons that have nothing to do with adoption. But through adoption, a loving home was provided for children who couldn't be raised by their parents for whatever that reason might be. But that's how things used to be. Today, people, more often than not, if they are diagnosed with infertility at their OB/GYN, normally that's the first place that is discovered, they're going to turn to assisted reproductive technologies. So they're going to turn to the medical community before they turn to the adoption community for the most part. And so now medical science is helping people successfully bring children into their families, and that's a really great thing. So for most couples, the next step is seeking assistance from a medical specialist rather than through the adoption community. And the end result of that is medical science kind of got ahead of the social and emotional issues attached to creating children through assisted reproductive technologies. And now the end result is that we have over 600,000 frozen embryos in storage in the United States. And so the thing that the embryo adoption agencies are doing is to try and help reduce the number of embryos in frozen storage. Next slide, please. Kelly, why don't you take this one?
Okay. Good morning. Thank you for joining us. As most of you know, in the fertility industry, they have had great results and many, many success stories of thousands of families who this has been their answer, and they've given birth to a healthy baby, and it's just been their answer to everything that they've wanted as far as a family. Some of these families have had even more success than they could ever imagine, and now they have these remaining frozen embryos. But there are treatment limits in the fertility industry as far as potential treatment options are not always available to all patients because maybe your clinic does not have access to donor embryos, or maybe you cannot use those embryos due to some FDA regulations unless they are donated through a known designated donation program. So that's been a limit to those clinics.
Right. And I would add to that, Kelly, that, sometimes clients that we've had here at the Snowflakes program have been through failed IVF multiple times.
Multiple times, yes.
Yeah, and then they they do have success using donated embryos, primarily because the embryos they were using had some sort of genetic defect.
Right. Mm-hmm. Next slide.
I had to mute myself for a minute so I get that frog out of my throat there. Okay, so what is the history of embryo adoption? I mean, some of you clinic folks that are joining us today might be like, well, how did this thing ever come about? So we know that the first test tube baby was back in the late 70s. In 1983, embryo donation was pioneered within the medical community. In the mid-1990s, the executive director of Nightlight Christian Adoptions became aware of the large number of embryos in frozen storage. He was listening to a radio program, and the story was about the number of embryos in frozen storage in the United Kingdom, not even in the United States. And he had found that disturbing, but wasn't really motivated to do anything at that point. In 1997, he was approached by a client who was interested in international adoption, but who was also working with an infertility clinic to try and achieve pregnancy. And that client was approached by the clinic to use donated embryos to achieve pregnancy. And it was through numerous conversations between that client-patient and the executive director here at Snowflakes where it became clear that you could work with a donor family who wanted to choose who the adopting family was, and that the current adoption model fit really well into making that work. And so in 1997, the Snowflakes Embryo Adoption Program was established. Since that time, I think our most recent birth was baby number 325. There have been over 3,500 children since the mid-90s that their birth can be attributed to embryo donation. And so back in 1998, the very first baby adopted as an embryo was born, and her name is Hannah Strege, and that is actually Hannah resting on her daddy's shoulder. In 1999, embryo donors began coming to adoption agencies seeking to donate their embryos because they wanted to choose who received their embryos, much like in the domestic adoption model today, where we allow the birth mother to choose the adopting family 9 times out of 10. There are times when these things are happening anonymously, but what we have found repeatedly is, especially with embryo donation, that couples are more motivated to donate their embryos to another family if they can choose that family. Since the beginning of embryo adoption, as process, we can attribute over 1,000 live births to embryo adoption agencies throughout the country. Next slide, please. So embryo adoption was kind of a natural step for the adoption industry and a way to bring the best practices of adoption into this realm of medical science where medicine was helping people achieve pregnancy. We have no qualms with that whatsoever. We think that is great. But we also have to look at what are we doing to help these people who have remaining embryos after they've given birth to all the children they want to have in their family. So the process of embryo adoption, even though it is not a legal adoption in the United States, it is not a legal adoption process because embryos are considered property in the United States, using the adoption model is child-centric in its orientation. It brings peace of mind to the donor because they get to choose who the recipient family is for these embryos that they have remaining. And remember, these families more than likely have fully genetically related siblings to the embryos that are in frozen storage. So before they created those embryos, they might have thought one way about the embryos and what did they mean to them. And after they've given birth to these children, oftentimes these embryos become more highly valued. So applying the adoption process to the model brings peace of mind to the donor, and it also gives security to the adopters because they know they're able to access information about the donor family and about the origins of these embryos. I'm sure there's more I have to say about that, but I think that's going to come up in another slide. So let's move on. So there are parallels between adoption and donor history. Some of you may or may not be aware of a new website that's out there. It's been around for several years now, but it's called the Donor Sibling Registry. And it was established because of some of the problems that have come about as a result of using donor egg, donor sperm, donor embryos. There's a parallel because historically use of donor egg, donor sperm, donor embryo was kind of held in secrecy and anonymity. You know, we'll just do this. Nobody will know that it isn't our genetic material that we used. And so we're just going to keep this a secret. Certainly that was the model for adoption from the middle of the last century until about the 70s to 80s. And so that what the adoption professionals learned is that that really isn't in the best interest of the child to create this secrecy. Secrecy is never a good thing when it comes to human relationships. What also has happened is that donors of egg and sperm and embryos, there's anonymity historically associated with that, and so children grow up and they're in this secrecy and they don't know about their real origins. And when families keep secrets, you know, at some point, Great Aunt Dorothy is somehow going to slip up and somebody's going to hear something, and that opens the door, and that can just create devastation in the life of a child. So we really feel like the adoption model and the reforms that have been brought about in adoption are a good thing for the children who have been created through donor egg, sperm, and embryo. Next slide, please. The other thing that is occurring with sperm donor children is that there are claims regarding improper genetic testing of the sperm donor. There are lawsuits that are occurring now that you've probably read about in the news where the donor is seeking medical information about the sperm donor. The Donor Sibling Registry, there are over 37,000 people, both donors and children, who were created through donor material that are looking for one another, and one of those donors, it was discovered, actually multiple of these donors, but one in particular, has over 130 children out there that his sperm was used to create. And it's like, I don't know about you guys, but to me that seems, there's something wrong about that, you know, and so we need to be bringing some more, I don't know, just honesty around the process and controls around the process. For egg donor children, the entire generation of women in America has been taught for many years that, hey, you can put off having children until you're older, you know, pursue your career, pursue your education. And what you as medical professionals know is that a woman's eggs start declining in their quality quite rapidly after the age of 30. I myself dealt with infertility and chose not to go through IVF and got pregnant the normal way when I was 45. But I call that girl my last good egg because I know my eggs as a 45-year-old were the likelihood of having a healthy, wonderful daughter that I have was pretty slim. So the Snowflakes program advocates for open adoption between both parties so that both parties are known by one another, and even if an anonymous donation is chosen, because we do have people donate anonymously through the Snowflakes program, there is still a record that is kept by the adoption agency. And if you are not familiar with adoption agency procedures, one of the things that adoption agencies are required to do by law for international and domestic adoption is to keep records forever. And so because adoption agencies are applying the best practices to embryo adoption as well, the records are kept forever for the embryo adoption process too. Next slide, please. So this slide is representative of something that in the adoption world that's called the adoption triad. And this involves the agency, the embryo donors, in a birth mother instance, that would be the birth mother, and the adoptive or recipient parents. And the agency is acting as the intermediary, acting on the best, on the behalf of the child, the best practices on behalf of the child between the donor and between the adoptive recipient parents of those donated embryos. Next slide, please. Oh, Kelly, I'm going to turn it over this section to you.
Great. Next, we kind of want to look at what is the benefit of working with Snowflakes to your clinic. And I hope that you'll see that the benefits could be many. Next slide, please. We want you to focus on what you guys do best, and hopefully we could help you in one way by reducing some of the administrative responsibilities. The Snowflakes program does manage our own embryo donation and adoption program. We would hope that we could reduce the clinic paperwork and any future clinic liabilities that you may be concerned about. We do, you guys would maintain control of your embryo birth statistics. We keep those records as well. Snowflakes provides educational brochures for your patients about embryo disposition, as well as educating them on all of their options, things that they can do, that kind of thing. And hopefully we would reduce the number of abandoned embryos that are stored in your clinic and could help you in hopefully finding a good home for them as well. Next slide, please. Snowflakes also takes care of the embryo donor screening and testing. Any of the required FDA screening and testing we take care of. We have a test kit that we send out to our genetic families that is FDA approved, and we run all the standard FDA panels. Our genetic families fill out an FDA risk assessment, and they all do physical evaluations as well. So hopefully when you're working with Snowflakes, you'll find that you get a complete package on the embryo donors in that process. Next slide, please. We also offer, as we discussed, some educational assistance for your clients, for our clients. direct educational assistance. We talk with them about remaining embryos, their disposition choices, what they have that they can do with those embryos. Our families, our adoptive families, have to complete a home study process, which is pretty intensive. And as the slide shows, 80% of the home study process is education. Education about their choices, education about adoption, education about future for their children and how to talk to them about their process, education about how to have contact with the genetic family, the donor family. All of those type of things are covered in an home study process as well as an evaluation process to screen them and make sure that they are qualified to adopt. We develop and present free monthly educational webinars such as this one for adoptive families, genetic families. Many, many options are available to help educate people during this process. Next slide, please. Snowflakes does offer a personalized matching service. We do match people. It's very personal. We do it one-on-one. It's unbiased. We try to look at all the choices that they have given us. The donors give us a list of criteria that they're looking for in a genetic family, in an adoptive family, and we really try to honor their top preferences, if not all of their preferences. And they can choose to be involved in that process or not be involved in that process. And wherever they fall on that spectrum, we are happy to meet them there and try to meet their needs as best we can. We do not discriminate based on anything, including religion, marital status, sexual orientation, nothing like that. The clinic does not have to spend any time matching donors to recipients. That's something that we would certainly take care of and hopefully alleviate some of that from your process. Next slide, please. It encourages patients to donate their embryos. A directed donation allows patients who sometimes have maybe an adverse medical history to donate remaining embryos. We do have people in the program who tested positive maybe for hepatitis, or maybe they're a cystic fibrosis carrier or something like that. And although it takes a little longer to match those embryos, we have had success in getting them matched and having them adopted and doing a frozen embryo transfer with them. The FDA does allow recipients to receive embryos from known donors where there is a positive infectious disease test, as we just talked about, and Snowflakes does accept all embryos. Like I said, we have several embryos who the genetic family, one of the parents tested positive for something. Also, benefit to your patients is that patients are more likely to donate their embryos when they're able to choose the recipient. Most people really like that they can be involved in that process and that type of thing, but as said before, if they do not want to be involved with that process, then they certainly don't have to be. Next slide, please. Our hope would be that this would also increase revenue for the clinic. New frozen embryo transfer patients would be directed to your clinic, hopefully bringing in new revenue to you. Many of the clients who come to Snowflakes don't have an endocrinologist yet, or they do not have a clinic yet, or some of them just say, you know what, I've tried with this clinic, it hasn't gone well, or I had a bad experience, or something like that, and I'd like to start with a new clinic. And so hopefully we could direct them your way, and that would be a new client for you, and we would help facilitate that process as well. Next slide, please. As far as contracts go, we would handle all of the legal contracts between the parties. They're provided by us and they're managed by us, and you would not be responsible for any of the transfer of the embryo ownership from one party to the other. And we would make sure that you got a copy of that contract so you were aware that this was a legal event and it did take place and everyone has signed off on this. But your clinic would not be liable for any of the records, the storage, any of the future communication between the parties, anything like that. And if one of your clients, our clients, did want to have an outside counsel and attorney review it, that would absolutely be completely okay. Next slide, please. As far as the frozen embryo transferring itself, we would help you arrange and set all that up, or they can travel to your clinic, and that would be a seamless, easy process. They just travel there, and you would do the FET, or we can ship the embryos to the recipient's clinic, and they could do their frozen embryo transfer there. But we would coordinate all the shipments between the clinics, and we would pay for the embryo shipment between the facilities as well. Next slide, please. A benefit that we think is very important in our program is future contact. We would manage all the communication between the donors and the adopters, and we would keep that on file. We would have those records here. We would manage all of those. That's not something that you would have to be involved in. We would keep all the records. We do share with families any and all information that they want to know. Hands down, most people want to know the thawing and transfer results. They want to know if there's a pregnancy and a birth. They want to know if the child's healthy and developing and that type of thing. And we do get a post-placement report on the children as well from the agency that did their home study, just to give the donor families a peace of mind that, yes, everything is going well, the child is flourishing, growing, developing, all of those things are going well, or whatever is the case. So it does give the donors a great peace of mind. Again, if they choose not to be involved or don't want that information, that is certainly their right, but we would have all that information here should they ever choose to want to in the future as well.
Yeah, and Kelly, I would just add to that, because you have future medical emergencies there as well. I know an RE that we've worked with in the Midwest clearly communicated in another webinar that we had that one of the things he likes about partnering with an agency is this future contact that is not the onus of the agency, and that he can go to sleep at night knowing that nobody's going to be contacting him in the middle of the night with an emergency trying to get in touch with the donor family, because all of that is going to be handled by the adoption agency, the communication between both the donor and the adopter.
Absolutely. Next slide.
Okay, I think I'm going to pick up here. We would also be offering your clinic some promotional support and educating your patients about embryo donation and adoption, to help you in communicating to potential donors about why they might want to consider donation. This could be a benefit to your clinic in that you would get more donors into your embryo donation program that you may have in-house. We do have many donors that come to us from throughout the nation, so we get donors from all over the place. But we would be working to do the promotion of embryo donation and adoption throughout the country. We would have a listing of your clinic on our partnership website at snowflakes.org. And new Snowflakes clients are oftentimes educated about our clinic partners and where are some clinics where we have worked with them in the past and what our experience with those clinics has been. And so we would be promoting you as a clinic as a partner of the Snowflakes program. Next slide, please. Okay, so we want you to concentrate on what your clinic does best, which is practice medicine. And what we're trying to communicate to you is that in partnering with an adoption agency, you are going to allow the adoption agency to help you create better patient care for your patients by taking care of the social and emotional elements associated with having remaining embryos or trying to achieve pregnancy through embryo adoption. Next slide, please. So the process we've tried to lay out here so you can kind of see in a process flow, what does the process of embryo adoption look like. There's the application phase. The adopting family fills out an application. The donor family also fills out an application. There is no cost to the donor family. All of the cost associated with this process is borne by the recipient family. Each of the families is writing down what their preferences are so that when the matching process begins, we can try and match the families and match their preferences as best as we can. The clinic provides the donor medical records to the program. Snowflakes coordinates the FDA requirements for the donor and what we need to know about the donor, so we complete that process with no additional cost to your clinic. Then we enter into the matching phase, and this is where many clinics are very interested in working with an embryo adoption agency. I work with clinics on really all over the country, but many of them have donor programs, but they want to do that anonymously. But if they have a patient who comes to them and says, well, I want to pick who receives my embryos, those clinics are sort of at a loss because that's not part of what they do. They're not administratively interested nor able to accommodate the request to do a directed match. And that's where having a partner in embryo adoption helps you to improve your patient care, because you can then say to that patient, yeah, we have a way for you to do that, and the matching is all done by the Snowflakes program. Then again, Snowflakes, as Kelly mentioned, is taking care of all the contracts, because in the United States, embryos are property, and so that is managed by property contract law, and that is all managed by the Snowflakes program. We would coordinate which clinic is going to be doing the embryo transfer on behalf of the recipient family, and that, again, can be either your clinic, because maybe the donated embryos are in storage at your clinic, or maybe the recipient really wants to have the transfer done at the clinic of their choice. So Snowflakes, again, coordinates all that, so there's no administrative burden on your clinic to do that. And really the end result we're hoping for is the birth of babies, because those embryos were created for life, and we really want to give each of those embryos an opportunity to have life. Next slide, please. We do ask both families to fill out a family profile, so that as we're trying to go through the matching process, we have information that we can share with the families. What I will tell you is that the matching process, and this might be on a future slide that I have in here, is really controlled by the donor family in our program. The donor family reviews recipient family profiles first. They get to decide, wow, does that family sound like a good fit for what our preferences were? And if they were, they receive this family profile about the recipient family. A lot of times there's empathy, a lot of empathy between these families, because they're both experienced with infertility. Now, not every family who adopts embryos has experienced infertility, but Kelly, I would say the majority of them, 90+% have.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah. And so we're managing this process as well through the matching phase. Next slide, please. The clinic who is providing the embryos is providing the cryopreservation report, the freeze and thaw report, the things that the clinic is required to provide. This is like the only onus of the whole process on the clinic, is these records that you already have. So there isn't anything in addition that is being required of you. It's things that you've already collected on behalf of the patient that you have who has the remaining embryos. Would you say that's a true statement, Kelly?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Okay. Next slide, please. Snowflakes, as Kelly mentioned earlier, coordinates all of the FDA risk assessment questionnaires, the physical evaluations, the FDA panels for infectious disease on the donor. And again, the process of directed donation allows donors who may have embryos that where the parents tested positive for infectious disease, those can be placed in a directed donation. And so clinics are also relieved of that burden, because maybe they have a donor who has embryos that are in this situation, and they kind of have to say, well, geez, we can't help you because we can't place those embryos with the recipient. But the reality is if you're working with an embryo adoption agency and the donor is able to make a directed donation, that is a hurdle that can be overcome. Next slide, please. So I kind of already talked about this, but we go through the matching phase. The Snowflakes program manages that. The donor family chooses the adoptive family first. Then the adoptive family has the opportunity to review the donor family and decide if that's a match that they would like to do. I will tell you that not every first match that Snowflakes comes up with is successful. Sometimes the adoptive family says, well, they're not very interested in matching with that particular donor family. I would encourage you to visit the embryoadoption.org website on our video section, because we have had a couple of webinars, in the webinar section, our historical archived webinars, because we have a couple of webinars that we've done here within the last 6 months where donors and adopters are talking about their embryo adoption experience. And I know at least one of those families is talking about how, well, you know, we got matched with this family, but we really felt like this aspect and that aspect weren't really good for us, and so we went on to the next family. So nobody has to take the match that Snowflakes comes up with. I mean, we can work and work and work until a match that is mutually agreeable between the two parties is attained. Next slide, please. So in the Snowflakes contracts, we have communication agreement is a part of that contract. Again, we've been talking a lot about open adoption and the process of open adoption. We have the families write down what they're agreeing to. And oftentimes what we find is the families might initially be fairly conservative about what the level of communication is going to be between them, but as time goes on, they become less fearful, if you will, because there is a fear factor between people who don't know each other, but they really open up the lines of communication. And maybe, for example, they were only communicating with the agency as the intermediator, but maybe as they go forward, they determine that, oh, you know, it's okay for us to talk to them directly, and they open up the lines of communication even more. The contract management is all handled by the Snowflakes program, and everybody receives copies of those, including the clinic receives a copy of the final documentation contractually. The clinic is not a part of the contract, nor does the clinic have any signature line within the contract. Next slide, please. So we've talked about the shipment and transfer of the embryos. Snowflakes does coordinate that. That is paid for by the recipient family if it is required. What we are repeating here is that the frozen embryo transfer can occur at your clinic, or it can occur at the recipient's clinic of choice. And that's all part of negotiating the whole process and figuring out what is best for the donor and the adopter and the clinic that's involved. Next slide, please. So here, you know, I'm not expecting you to read through this slide right now because that's a lot of language on there, but there are so many benefits that your clinic would derive in partnering with an adoption agency. And again, what we're trying to communicate in this webinar is that we want you to focus on what you do best, and that's the practice of medicine, and allow us to do what we do best, which is the practice of adoption. Because the reality is when somebody receives donated embryos from another family, the end result is going to be the birth of a child, and that child is not genetically related to that family, and that is the definition of adoption. And that's why we feel applying the best practices of adoption to the process is really important. And it also brings so many benefits to your clinic in regards to providing even better patient care and helping your patients make disposition decisions about remaining embryos, reducing the number of embryos that you have in storage, taking the burden of more administrative things away from your clinic and putting it onto the adoption agency who is already organized and prepared to manage those administrative things. So I'd really like you to be thinking about for your clinic, wow, there are a lot of benefits for us in working with an embryo adoption agency, and we'd really like to consider doing that. And hopefully you and I can be having a conversation about that here in the near future. Next slide, please. Don't you love the picture of this little baby? I don't know how my education coordinator, Coralie Whitby, does it, but she always makes the most beautiful slide presentations and gets great pictures. So kudos to you, Coralie. So even families that choose an anonymous adoption, an anonymous placement or an anonymous adoption, they can get important information relayed through the Snowflakes program. And so the families can always have contact with one another. Again, that is mutually agreed upon between the families, and that is managed by the adoption agency, not the clinic. And even in the future, as genetic siblings want to potentially know each other, that is always a possibility too. Next slide, please. The Embryo Adoption Awareness Center has created a lot of resources to help in this education process. So next slide. Some of the brochures we have are specific for the donor. The one on the right, which has the blue-eyed baby, is a disposition brochure. It's a single-sided brochure. I mean, both sides are printed on, but it's not one of those trifold brochures. It's pretty heavyweight paper. We have many clinics throughout the country who use this particular brochure in their billing when they're sending out their storage bills for the next year of storage for embryos to help. It's a great time in the life of the donor to be thinking again about, wow, I do have remaining embryos. What am I going to do with those? So that's a nice bill insert. The Snowflakes program also in the last year established a storage program with the Fairfax Cryobank, and we call that our Embryo Storage Solutions program. And it is for people who are choosing to donate their embryos through the Snowflakes program. They can store their embryos for a reduced fee at Fairfax Cryobank. And during the year that the embryos are potentially in storage, the matching is being done by the Snowflakes team. Usually we haven't had embryos in that cryobank for more than 6 months, so patients have never had to pay another year of storage, which is also at a reduced fee for them. But this storage program has proven very successful for many donors who have chosen to donate through the Snowflakes program. Next slide, please. So we think that Snowflakes is simple and successful, and we really want to encourage you in your clinic to consider helping your patients learn more about donating their embryos, and even potentially talking to patients about using donated embryos rather than creating new embryos using donor eggs or donor sperm. We have some brochures that are available. This one on the right is particularly about just embryo adoption in general. The one in the center there is a Snowflakes adoption brochure, and these are available to your clinics as well. Next slide, please. We also have very comprehensive information available on the Internet. The Embryo Adoption Awareness Center website is a central repository and provides neutral information about embryo adoption agencies and clinics around the country who have embryo donation programs. It has a very comprehensive FAQ section. We have lots of videos, and I would encourage you to visit our video section. There are a lot of great testimonial videos available on there. And we also have an education section on there now that you don't see in the menu bar layer right now, but we have all of these webinars that we've been presenting. We've recorded and are stored and available for viewing online. And then we also can arrange for personal contact to your patient, either a donor or a recipient who would like to talk to somebody who's actually done this before. And that's really a nice resource to have available. Next slide, please. So embryo donation and adoption creates families. And obviously, as an adoption agency, that's what we're about. As a clinic who helps families achieve pregnancy, that's what you're about. And we think a partnership between the two of us would be something that is beneficial not only to you, but also to your patients and to their success in building a family. With that, I would like to encourage you to submit your questions. Again, how you submit your questions is you type it into that, next slide please, Corley. You type it down there into that rectangular section and press the send button, and we would be able to see your question. I'm having such trouble with my throat today. I really apologize for that. And I'd like to also let you know about some upcoming webinars that are going to be here in February. We have clinic webinars that we host every month on the third Wednesday of the month, and then on the fourth Wednesday of the month we offer adoption agency webinars, and these are the webinars that we have coming up in February. You can register for any of our webinars by visiting embryoadoption.org. Okay, with that, I think we'll go over here and see what kind of questions we have submitted already. Let me read through these. Are you able to see these too, Kelly?
No, I don't see any.
Okay. Well, let me look through them, and I will read them out loud, and then you and I can answer them. Okay, so somebody is wondering what kind of success stories we have for women who are 40 and over. Kelly, you want to take that one?
Sure. I would say our success for 40 and over is about the same as any age. Most of our clients are nearing that range, if not already in that range, just because they've been through their own IVF treatments. They have, maybe they waited longer in life to try to get pregnant, then they went through IVF, and by the time they're ready for our program, then most of the time they are near that 40 to 45-ish range. And we've had great success with women getting pregnant and having healthy babies.
Yes, and I think we didn't talk about what the primary stipulation in participating in the embryo adoption program is, but it is just that the woman is able to provide a letter from her physician stating that there aren't any contraindications to her carrying a pregnancy to term.
Right.
And I think our oldest Snowflake mom was 48, right, Kelly?
Yes. Well, we have one now. We have a woman who's pregnant now who's 52.
52. All right.
Yeah.
I will tell you that the age of the recipient mother is a factor in the donor who is placing. And so the donor may look at the older parents and think, I'm not sure I want to place my embryos with a family where the parents are already that old. So the age of the parent is normally a factor associated with the donor more so than the ability of the woman to carry.
Right.
All right, next question here. What are the costs associated with this? Kelly, I'll let you take that.
Our program is all-inclusive. There are no hidden fees or anything like that. It is an $8,000 fee, and that includes the matching process. That includes the having the genetic family, sending out the lab kits, having them retested, getting those results to the clinic. It includes the shipping of the embryos if that's necessary, and it includes the contracts and whatever communication we have to do between the families, that kind of thing. So it's all-inclusive. There'll never be a hidden fee involved in that.
And I think I would add to that, Kelly, that in addition to the $8,000, there is the cost of the frozen embryo transfer and the cost of the adoption home study. So in reality, across all of the embryo adoption programs out there, if you're comparing apples to apples, it's going to cost you between $10,000 to $15,000 for an embryo adoption. And as I stated earlier in the presentation, none of the costs are borne by the donor.
No.
The donor is not reimbursed for their donation, nor are they reimbursed normally for any of their storage costs. If an agency is reimbursing a donor for storage fees, it's usually for fees that are incurred during the year that the donation is being made, but that's really rare. I'll say that that's very rare for the donor to be reimbursed for storage costs. Somebody's asking, can you highlight the possibility of clinics partnering with local adoption agencies to offer this service? I will tell you that the process of embryo adoption is unique enough that you would want to partner with an agency who has experience with embryo adoption, because it isn't quite the same as a domestic adoption or an international adoption. Each of these adoption programs is unique because, as you know, not every adoption agency offers international adoptions. Every country agencies specialize in different countries because there are unique aspects of dealing with each country for that international adoption. And I would liken Snowflakes to that as well, or an embryo adoption program to that. I have been working with some adoption agencies throughout the country to help them partner also with the Snowflakes program, to help them in offering embryo adoption through their program. And you can find a list of those agencies on the embryoadoption.org website, where we have all of the agencies who offer embryo adoption listed. But practically speaking, just connecting with an adoption agency in your area and asking them if they wanted to do an embryo adoption program partnership with you, it would be difficult to do because they don't have the experience. Would you like to add anything to that, Kelly?
No, I would agree. I mean, we're more than happy to work with any agency and that type of thing and help. We have, like, education that we can help them with and those type of things, but I would definitely agree with Kimberly that it needs to be somebody who is this is a very unique situation and who is versed in working with embryo adoption.
In an ideal situation, Kelly, how fast can an embryo adoption occur?
In an ideal situation, it can happen very quickly. We have a great staff at Snowflakes, and we are usually able, once we have all of your information, meaning your doctor's letter, your profile, and your home study, we will probably get you sent out to an adoptive family, sent out to a genetic family that week. So within that first week, they'll be sent out, and we ask the genetic family to get back to us within a week. If they need more time, that's fine. But usually within that second week, then they have gotten back to us and said yes or no. And then we'll get the information out to the adoptive family from the genetic family and ask them to take another week. So in an ideal situation, within that first 3 weeks, you could potentially be matched.
That would be, Kelly, if you're bringing a completed home study to the table.
Right. Right. If you don't have a home study done, then however long it takes, I mean, it could take you, 3 weeks to 3 months to 6 months to get a home study done, depending on how fast and how quickly you work through that process. And then, contracts and shipping and those type of things just take a matter of making sure that the clinic, the receiving clinic, has all of the necessary information that they need in order to receive the embryos. And once they have all of that and we have the signed contracts back, then we will set up shipping at the convenience of both clinics involved.
And here's another question. Does the clinic have to sign something that states that they are prohibited from working with another embryo adoption program? And the answer to that is no.
No.
Okay, let me see if we have anything else here. I would encourage you to submit your questions now because I think we're going to be winding down. Okay. Yeah, I think the other questions that have been submitted have already been answered. So anyway, I think that brings us to the close of our program. I see we're about 4 minutes away from the top of the hour, so we're right on time. I want to thank you all for attending today, and I hope that you've seen that the program that we offer here through Snowflakes and even embryo adoption in general is really a great opportunity to apply some really good practices that have been developed through the adoption industry to what you guys are doing in the medical industry to help people achieve what their dream is, and that is a family. Thank you so much for joining us today. We are going to be sending out the follow-up information that I mentioned earlier, so be expecting that from us. And we hope that we will be hearing from you through joining us in a webinar in the future, and you can always call us at any time. You can find us at embryoadoption.org or snowflakes.org. Thanks so much, Kelly. Thanks for joining us today, and have a great rest of your day. Bye-bye.
Bye.